Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to you, Chief Constable, your team, and all those watching online. We're also joined today by Graham Bitter, Director General of the National Crime Agency, to give us a report. You're very welcome. This is our first public meeting in our new offices, so hopefully all goes to plan. Particularly welcome to our visitors from Fordham, and also to Sean McCourt Kelly, and who is with us today in the public gallery. You're very welcome, and most welcome. Chief Constable, your report sets out the budget allocation now confirmed, and it's not a pretty picture. We know that the delivery of all policing services is not possible within the resources available, and there is now a need to explain the implications to the public so that they are clear on what we are going to expect going forward. Crime figures published at the end of financial year end increased, which further illustrates the daily demands on the service. And we, of course, know that behind every statistic, there is a victim who has an expectation of a policing response. We have committed to keep a focus on local policing, but we have a responsibility to tell the public how the service will need to adjust to meet current and future demand. And we have a responsibility to the officers and staff in terms of the resilience to deliver. And that is a point I made at last week's Federation conference. On BBC Spotlight, Chief Constable, as a board, we've held a private briefing session with you this morning. We sought and you have provided assurances around issues that emerged in the recent BBC Spotlight programme on past practice on using members of the public to gather intelligence and current policy. The board's Human Rights Advisor has been reviewing issues regarding policy and practice following media reports regarding the Investigatory Powers Tribunal hearing earlier this year. He has provided us with an interim update, but the board will be asking him to carry out some further work so that we will have full assurance regarding these matters. There are, of course, ongoing litigation matters regarding the case featured in the programme, which are of a particular concern in terms of the financial liability now faced by policing. These and other matters related to civil actions taken against the police service will be considered further by the board's Resources Committee. Chief Constable, turning now to better news, on behalf of the board, can I say that we're all delighted to see the remarkable progress made by DC Caldwell, and we would wish to pass on to him and his family our best wishes. He truly is an inspiration. I also want to place on record our thanks to Detective Chief Superintendent Eamon Corrigan and all those involved in this massive investigation for the tenacious work to date, which has resulted in arrest and charges. And finally, Chief Constable, some news on your own, which has been aired publicly, but can be announced officially that there's departmental approval has been received for your Chief Constable extension. The board agreed unanimously to offer you a 3-year contract extension from the 1st of July 2024 until the 1st of July 2027. In agreeing this, the board wanted to keep certainty and ensure continuity of leadership of the police service. As I have said already, we are very aware of the new challenges for policing going forward in terms of resourcing, and we'll be looking to you for bringing new plans forward to support the future delivery of policing and leading the organisation through what will be difficult challenges ahead. So we're pleased you're accepted, and now that the formal bit of the business has been approved, it's back to business as usual. Director General, can I hand over to yourself?
Well, thank you, Chair. There are a number of matters, I think, to sort of respond to this morning, although conscious there's a lot to get through, and it's good to see Graham here because some of us we've had numbers of conversations about. In terms of my own comments, firstly to say thank you. I'm really pleased to be staying a bit longer and to accept the offer as an extension, but I also recognise there's an expectation that we're going to have to reset the structure of the organisation and some of the emphasis in what we're doing, and we'll probably either tease some of that out this morning or certainly through some of the proposals we'll be bringing both to committee and then to full board once it's gone through our own governance, and we'll probably come back to that a bit later. I think also starting where you sort of finished off, I also was really pleased to see John's progress and also to pay tribute to Eamon and the investigative team that have done so much work in a relatively quick period of time to result in charges, as you saw at the weekend. And I was able to see firsthand last week and over the weekend just how hard some of those officers have been working in a particularly complex case. But obviously, as it's now live proceedings, I won't say much more than that. But we will continue to support John and his family through the process of recovery that we're now pleased to see. Similarly, though, we're not complacent. We still operate under a severe threat. Mark and I have almost daily conversations about that. And you'll see only this week further evidence of the determination of some people to cause us harm. Further investigations into the activities of the new RA in the northwest of the country, and you'll see yesterday images of firearms and other matters that were recovered following house searches over there. It's probably too quick to forget some of the breadth of things that we've been dealing with as well. I'm pleased to see Chris Todd here today, who has been our sort of point person for various visits from presidents to royalty, but we obviously policed 2 days of a royal visit last week, really successfully, and actually without any incident whatsoever. So that's, again, a tribute to Chris and his team. Conscious in what is quite a warm room today that we're also now in the midst of busy summer weather. AC Singleton may touch later on some of the sort of day-to-day policing challenges that you sort of put in the room to a certain extent, Chair, that we're having to carry on with all the complexity. But at this meeting demand, you'll see this weekend, as the sunshine continues, how we'll shift some resources to police beauty spots and other places to try and stay one step ahead of traditional sort of antisocial behaviour issues. But crucially, I think there's two big issues just to tease into my opening remarks this morning. One is the structure and what will start to look differently, and also I'll come on to at the end about the issue of mental health and the effects it's having on policing. So when we sort of started to assess, not just that the budget was grim, but when we got our final settlement, as a senior team, we've had a number of days together, and I've commissioned effectively a 90-day review that has two strands to it. One is those things that we can almost stop immediately, and we've come up with effectively with that short list, which has to go through our own governance just to get final sign-off, but they will realise something in the region of 15 to 17 million pounds of further savings. So we're not sitting here saying we can't do it, but we're also saying we'll come back to say these are things we will do, but inevitably it will mean things are different. And I'll touch on that very quickly in a minute, what that will likely look like. But more fundamentally, we've also commissioned a work about a reset of the organisation to cope with less people, but more work. And to give a flavour of that, we'll be starting where the public first contacts us, so in the 999 phone centres. Our ambition is to keep the integrity of that sort of personal contact with the public absolutely ring-fenced, so that we want to be able to promptly still address 999 calls for all sorts of reasons and promptly attend to them. But it will raise other questions about how we reshape, if you like, our online offer so that people can do more transactions with us online. For example, some is already there, but some we want to improve on in terms of report incidents, accidents, and sort of get service from us online. But we can also expect some degradation in the 101 service because we simply can't do two things at once. And that actually has been an issue of concern in the past. We will then move into the organisation to ask ourselves what response teams do, what the secondary support that they could expect to keep them on the road, as it were, and turning up to these calls, for example, around secondary investigation, how custody works, and then crucially around neighbourhood policing. So I think one of the things we've recognised that at the moment still is widespread support for this. And even in some of the recent events, it's worth remembering that 2/3 of our counter-terrorism intelligence comes from neighbourhood policing teams. So their footprint in communities is not just important for reassurance and visibility, but also part of our fight against terrorism. We recognise, and some members of the board were probably picking up sort of critique from either inside the organisation, from experience, that neighbourhood officers increasingly aren't where we want them to be. They're getting diverted to do other things, to backfill other functions. But we have sat down as a team, and one of the things we want to bring back to you is that we don't want to lose that core offer to the public, but we're going to have to probably sort of reconfigure it quite dramatically differently. You remember, probably some members a while ago, that my predecessors sort of ended up with a neighbourhood policing offer that just covered certain parts of the country. We want to keep it still as a universal service, but what they do, I think, will start to look different, and we've got to make some system and process changes so that the officers that remain as numbers shrink, are actually dedicated and not moved off their roles to go and staff a front office or come into Belfast to police a demonstration or whatever it happens to be. Some of the more short-term stuff, and I have to caveat this with the phrase likely, because we haven't fully signed it off and then we need to come back to yourselves. But I know it's the sort of question on everyone's lips, but they include things like, you can anticipate we will be pausing sort of mass police officer and civilian staff recruitment from the end of June. We will keep that under review because the organisation could shrink faster than we've anticipated, but you can obviously see the consequences. We'll also be looking quite radically at which police stations stay open to the public or the opening hours of those offices, because again, I think the priority is to put officers on the streets rather than having officers or managed service staff behind desks. We are likely to withdraw some of our support for CCTV viewing in councils across the country. And inevitably, we will be running the service with a smaller fleet and probably a smaller air fleet as well, which will be tough choices in terms of the policing of operations if we've got less aircraft to help us do that. There will probably be further deterioration of the estate, which obviously is yours, less investment in IT, but also some questions about links with other agencies. So this is where probably it brings into play some of the recent commentary, which I know is of importance to people. From, if you look, that's the jump off point, if you will, from comments made last week in the Metropolitan Police. Mark and I have been discussing this for a while. He has already begun a sort of a dialogue with the Department of Justice to engage the Department of Health into this issue. We would see similar issues to other parts of the UK where we have police officers in A&E dealing with mental health service calls, etc. And some of the symptoms and causes are not dissimilar, but we're anxious at announcing an immediate withdrawal because our fear is, A, is it contrary to some of our values and ethos around care, community policing, etc. And equally, just to withdraw now against a system that's already broken, I don't think is going to necessarily solve the problem. It'll just put more pressure. I was only yesterday talking with somebody whose experience in A&E, frankly, was quite horrendous. And if we sort of walked out and just added to that pressure, I just think will present sort of unmanageable problems for health colleagues. That said, there are probably some practice things within how we triage certain calls. There is room for improvement, and that's where Mark will probably want to take things. It's also worth sort of pointing out to members, because we've looked at this in some detail, but without judging what Sir Mark has said, or indeed other chiefs in the UK, because that's, or GB, that's the matter for them, because I'm not sat with their in-tray and their problems. But we do operate here in a slightly different framework. So we have legislative duties that are enshrined in the Police Act, which is different to England and Wales. We don't have that sort of connectivity that's in the legislation, for example, in crime and disorder or community safety partnerships, the same sort of relationships with local authorities to look at commissioning of services. So there's some systemic things as well as procedural things. And I think if we get back into a state of an executive and government, I've been sort of supporting the idea for 4 years now that what we need is a community safety board and indeed a community safety strategy for Northern Ireland to help put some of these things in a broader, more sustainable framework that brings other partners into the room alongside us. So that's something we're continuing to develop and may come back into questions this morning. But if I press pause there and then we'll take questions.
Thank you very much for that, Chief Constable. We have some questions across members, of course, and I'm going to go to Mike first on a question on Spotlight.
Thank you, Chief. The edition of the 16th of May was entitled Covert Cops When Spying Goes Wrong. If you agree spying did go wrong, can you explain how it was allowed to happen, your assessment of the reputational damage, and how can you assure us that the problem has been fixed?
Thanks, Mike. Well, certainly, clearly, any programme that shines a light where there's criticism has a risk of reputational damage, but equally, there are sometimes how we get our message across. We would assert that a lot that was said in the programme wasn't factually accurate, and we may come on to that in a minute, albeit we were given a right of reply. And similarly, you will know yourselves from sort of various pieces of dialogue. We've had oversight of that investigation effectively through the Public Prosecution Service, where we submitted sort of files to. Then we had an extensive investigation by the Ombudsman. We've also had further scrutiny from those people bring oversight to the regulatory powers that we use for surveillance, and then further sort of challenged by the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which probably all Mark will talk on. So there has been a lot of scrutiny. So, and I think the other thing to sort of explain to members and indeed the public, some of what was aired on the programme sort of conflates two issues. One was a police corruption inquiry, which we say actually is probably the largest single corruption inquiry we've launched since the beginning of the police service of Northern Ireland, alongside the use of what we would call members of the public to gather information in specific cases, which actually weren't germane to the corruption inquiry. So two issues are bubbled into each other, and I think added to some of that confusion. What I can say to members and the public is that some of the practice that was outlined then isn't the current practice of the police service. So we remain one of the most scrutinised and sort of highly regulated services anywhere in the UK and probably beyond. So that generally, if you like, our annual inspection process for the use of surveillance powers, which are quite broad ranging, always put us in a good light. Inevitably, there'll be sometimes things that say you need to do more on this and that, but they're not sort of showstopper sort of recommendations. Similarly, in terms of practice, some of the issues that were raised in the programme are no longer reflective of how we work. So this notion of ethical officers was a UK-wide phenomenon, which we ceased in 2020. It was something that I think had good intent, but there were sort of recommendations that Mark sort of looked at when he came in to his role as head of professional standards, where we reset the relationship between the counter-corruption unit and how we hold intelligence. So there has been a lot done. And even most recently, because it continues to be a matter of concern, when we've looked at some of the issues aired in the programme, there have been further communication by some of the parties in the programme to me personally, and a review of some of the issues that were known to us because of a legal review I commissioned. I've actually asked the Ombudsman now to satisfy herself that some of the elements that have been raised, is there further evidence or not that would engage her to have a further look at this. So she's taken some information away from me, and will come back doubtless in short time to say, actually, this is consistent with what they've already looked at, particularly around the allegation of inducements and payments, or not, and she may well then commence her own investigation. So that there's a lot at stake, we realise here, but I don't know, I've lost Mark, whether you want to say anything else in relation to this direct matter.
Yeah, no, I think you've pretty much covered it, Chief. I think there were three distinct areas. There was the Operation Henley, which, as the Chief Constable has said, there was an investigation into, and we believe was vindicated and justified. There are still some civil matters ongoing in that. There was the practice of how members of the public and covert human intelligence sources are governed and used, and we've taken some action around that as a separate issue. And then in the IPT, at the earliest possible, pardon me, at the earliest possible juncture, we declared what we thought was an issue that we had uncovered to the IPT in December 22, and we've accepted that and dealt with that.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to a question from Les on the deployment of police officers in relation to mental health issues.
Thank you, Chair. And Chief Constable, you mentioned the anxiety about withdrawal of services on attending issues relating to a mental health crisis in A&E or elsewhere. I wonder if you could say a little more about what are the options short of withdrawal that you're considering, and could you kind of elaborate on the attempts that have been made to resolve this with the health authorities and DOJ in the past, and also currently what the level of kind of conversations and discussions that you're having?
Probably easy to bring Mark in if I can, Chair, because this is something he's working on at the moment.
That's fine, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Les. Apologies, I'm a bit croaky today. Just to work backwards in the past, well, I mean, I'm sure I could bring in a stream of district commanders who have worked and people in public protection who have worked on specific areas of areas of memorandums, understandings and practices with health, right, around missing persons, attending children's homes, attending A&Es, and so forth. So there's a range of activity for many years, but there's never been probably an overarching strategy, an overarching connection of how justice and health come together. And that's why I've written to the Department of Justice, who confirmed they're willing to get involved in the conversation, and invited health to do so as well, about how we connect together better, as opposed to what I think has been, to this point, the series of very well intentioned and often with great outcomes processes between ourselves and local trusts or local care homes or A&Es and so forth. But there is now, as you can see across UK policing, a bit of a pinch point around the displacement of demand toward criminal justice, and it comes into point into two questions for me. One is, is the police service picking up demand that really should be dealt with somewhere else? But also then, in doing so, are we actually getting the right outcomes for the people who need help? So deploying police officers to people in mental health crisis may be necessary if there are dangers to the person and to the public, and only a police officer has the suitable equipment and training to resolve the danger that might present. But ultimately, is it always the best way forward? Deploying police negotiators instead of mental health professionals and so forth. So we have great examples of triage work with paramedics and social workers and police, where we bring everybody together and we actually get better outcomes. And I think where the police service would like to be is, rather than in a unilateral withdrawal of services, we'd like to be in a position that we argue for the best outcomes for the people of Northern Ireland, and that we contribute as appropriate to trying to deliver that, as opposed to being, in some respects, and I think our office should say, the kind of office, the service of last resort. There are very particular issues legally, I think, that we have to get our head around, Les. The issue that's being raised nationally is about where you assume a duty of care. At what point then that creates a legal obligation upon you. And if a police officer, if we take a call and accept it, does that mean that we assume the duty of care? If we attend a call, do we assume the duty of care? And these are some of the things that we need to sort out, because we do end up in waiting queues in hospitals for maybe 12 hours of people who we've taken to hospital. And really, is that the best thing? So we'd like to try and see if we can get this flattened out a bit more. There's also a very interesting point raised, in the debate about, even when police services take decisions unilaterally, there are then decisions to be made by police staff and police officers about individual calls that come to their attention, and we have to be sure that we don't expose our people to undue criticism for failing to act based upon a policy that we would decide. The other thing I'd say is, though, and this is very present, we are seeing quite a significant increase in stress-related illness inside the organisation, and stress-related injury and duty. And an awful lot of that, from my anecdotal position, is to do with overload on people. There's specific incidents and overload. And in the middle of all this, we have to be very aware that we're reducing the size of the service. Demand from the public is increasing, and the police officers and police staff have only limited human capacity to deal with what they're asked to do. So there is an imperative for our staff to try and get a better model for them. But equally, as a public servant, just shoving that off to some other public servant and letting them suffer isn't really the kind of joined up answer that I think we as a society should need. And the Chief Constable has talked about a community safety process reform and so forth. So we would be appealing that we join together to try and get the best outcomes, and that we then have a very mature discussion about where the right handoffs are for people, with proper triage of calls. It would be much better if mental health calls were triaged by a collective team at the point of call, and then the most appropriate resource deployed, as opposed to being separate, ambulance being separate from police and so forth. So there's a lot here to be discussed. But I do think some of it needs to be accelerated, because I think the pressure on the police is enormous, as is, I have to recognise, the pressure on the ambulance service.
Okay, thank you. And Joanne and then Linda on supplementary on this question.
Thanks very much, Chair. Chief, to some extent, you and Mark have decimated my question through your report and your answer to Les. But actually, I think this is a really worthwhile conversation for the public to hear. As you both cited there, recently other forces have indicated that they may not attend mental health situations, citing that the right people in the right place is key. We also know that a custody suite or a jail cell is not always the right place, and the PSNI are not always the right people. So given the significant budgetary pressures you describe in your report to us, Chief, as bleak, as you develop a policy about this and around this, and bearing in mind the balance on the mental health crisis outside in society and inside, and pressures inside your organisation, what factors are you going to bear in mind as you seek to produce a policy in this regard? And what more will you do to help your own staff who are going to be coming under increasing pressure? Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne. I think, again, we've touched on some of this, and Mark may well come in, but to give you some sense of this, I think actually there's maybe some short-term things we want to sort of try and achieve through the work that Mark's just mentioned with the Department of Health, Department of Justice, and ourselves. If some of the speculation around transformative funding bears fruit, if there's ever a new government in the short term, clearly ideas like this for the public sector, which we're all part, would you like to think are part of that aspiration? We can all see cases where how the front end starts is not ideal, and usually when something sort of unravels at the front, it has consequences far beyond that. So as Mark said, if we can get part of our sort of aspiration would be far better joined up call handling and deployment to then see what secondary aftercare looks like. I think there was another plea. We've managed to come to some agreement, but the whole custody healthcare issue doesn't need to be forgotten either. We are recruiting nurses to the new suite, which opens soon at Waterside. But again, our own evidence shows that when people come into custody, sometimes for quite legitimate reasons, because they have committed a crime, let's not forget. But we also know that if you like the offender population, many people suffer drug, alcohol, and other complex problems. And it is often the custody nurses that are spotting issues, sometimes before the sector has seen them. And they also need somewhere to refer things to. But I think actually it does raise bigger questions, which we would like to engage the board on around, well, actually, what is the purpose of policing? Because some of the narrative you see in England and Wales that policing is solely about crime fighting. And absolutely, that's part of our USP, that if your home's burgled, we catch who's done it. If you're attacked anywhere, that we're going to investigate it and follow. And we don't want to sort of lose sight of that. But I think some of my reflections here in the time I've been here, that part of our USP is also about being part of the community, being a compassionate police service that is there to support people. And sometimes it's not always easy to put an individual person into a box at the start of an incident and at the end of an incident. So that's where it starts to, if you like, unravel and become more complicated. So we don't want to lose that side either, because I think it's integral to trust and confidence and public support that we are seen as somewhere where you can turn to for advice rather than just, we ain't coming anymore. And I think that's going to be probably where the negotiation and the empathy needs to be. I think you raise a really important point as well about well-being. There is, as Mark said, increasing evidence that as we shrink, we're asking the same people to do more. And Pamela may come on some of this later, but we've also been looking at two other strands, because our capital allocation is actually slightly more than we were anticipating. But I've got some work I want to begin with the senior officer, Mel Jones, to really get sort of serious about rooting out bureaucracy. I've seen this numerous times in policing where we take away a few forms, but that really isn't what we're talking about. How we organise and how we sort of have that practical relationship within the service often creates as much hidden work as the demands from outside. But also it's about using IT effectively so that officers can sort of transact either internally again into the criminal justice system or with members of the public in a far more efficient way, which just frees up time. And then there's other work that Claire's been sort of leading for us on, and actual practical support and tools to aid officers and staff to cope with some of the stresses and strains that we all know are there. But I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in. Do you want to say anything else about IT?
Okay, go ahead. I'll come in a little bit. I mean, I think moreover on certainly our workforce, Joanne, it is a lot of the activity that Claire and the team in OHW are focusing on around the health and wellbeing of our own workforce is vitally important. Undoubtedly, as we look forward, where we've still got this level of demand and increasing demand on our service, we need to challenge ourselves in that we're productive and that we're effective and efficient with what we've got. And certainly from the estate and particularly the IT and reducing bureaucracy, that is hugely important. And you can see the frustration if you're out with the teams on the ground what that means for them. So there's an obligation to sort of make life as straightforward, make it relevant and up to date, just to ease those pressures a little bit, but by no means, and you know, wouldn't want anyone to think that it will fully replicate or satisfy or alleviate the pressures that the teams are feeling with a significant reduction in the workforce.
Okay, thank you, Pamela. An extension question from Linda on this issue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the answers so far. And it has covered some of the issues that I have, but we know that there have been pilot programs already tested in the past, but they've been pilots, and when the pilot has ended, nobody has picked up the cost. So, I mean, there is some good practice there that we know works. I think that needs to be picked up. We shouldn't be looking always for the new. There are some things that we know work. We need to go back and look at those. If these conversations, and I'm really, really glad to hear that the conversations are already happening, because we do need an executive to give the political leadership. You need a budget and resources, but we do need to be having the conversations in this period when we don't have that. And I'm really grateful to hear that's happening. But some of the conversations should be around that. We have pilot programs that we know worked. They were effective. They delivered for people. They delivered for both departments, but it was never picked up and rolled out. So agreement should be made, I believe, whenever a pilot is presented, agreement should be made at that point. If this pilot is shown to be effective, if we think that it is working, who is picking up the cost? Are we sharing the cost? Because otherwise, everything we're doing is actually a waste of money. And I have real concerns, and raised this repeatedly before with both departments and you know, here in the board as well. So for me, whenever we're rolling out a pilot, that is the point at which we agree. If this is something that works, how do we then fund it to be rolled out? I also have raised concerns before that all of the pilots are tested in areas that probably they are least needed. Now, I understand that is because the resources there, because they are the areas where it's least needed, but we need to start looking at that and seeing how we change that and how we can actually test it in areas where the highest need is, where the highest deprivation or the highest issues around drug and alcohol addiction, mental health issues, antisocial behaviour, all of those things. So we really need to look at how we're doing our pilots as well. And I understand that will be things that DOJ and health may well be taking the lead on. But I think when we're having our input, those are the conversations we need to be having. We need to be resourced to do these pilots in areas where the need is actually there.
Thanks, Lynn. I wouldn't disagree. I mean, certainly, I think Mark and Pamela both want to come in, so I won't say very much. But it's the obvious example is mental health triage, where even what has happened has been only a few days a week. Unfortunately, the problem presents around the clock 7 days a week. So if we're going to do triage, we need it all the time. And similarly, I think this issue, the biggest strategic question, not just for us, but for the whole of the public sector, is as it shrinks and changes, the very people that need support the most in communities right across the country are the people with, you know, deprivation, poverty, less life chances, and they're likely to suffer the most as services change and shrink. So I think it's looking at that in the round as well, but I know Mark wants to come in.
I won't labour. Part of the problem to date has been it is about money. Money runs out, and convincing everybody about the long-term benefits, because most managers now we're seeking shorter-term benefits because of the funding cycles. So everybody needs to be encouraged to be on the same page about the benefits of working collectively. The other thing, this is not a critique, but we have a different model for delivery of health services than we have to policing. Different governance models. I'm saying which one's right or wrong, but we have to deal with multiple trusts as opposed to a single entity when we're trying to get stuff done, and that produces governance issues for us as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to budget and to Peter on the impact of budget on recruitment, please.
Thanks, Chair. It's really I think it probably a follow-up question as well to the previous conversation. You've answered a number of the questions, and putting it into my words, it's good to hear the police saying that they'll never walk past a person in need, but it is about working collaboratively to get the right people in the right place at the right time for that person in need. And I think that's very comforting. I think it's also important not just to always look at the here and now, but to look sometime down the track. And while recruitment is paused, you're saying in June, at some point recruitment will reoccur, hopefully sooner rather than later. Can you provide some comfort about the actions the police or others should be taking to address something that has improved hugely, and that we're all, I think, united in wanting to see further improvement around representativeness of the police around gender or ethnicity or sexual orientation or community background. It's important to think about that now in anticipation of future recruitment, because there will be future recruitment.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's easier to just bring Claire on this one, because she can probably address outside, if you like, and inside, because there are live issues and still some things we can do.
Thank you. I mean, yes, as you've stated, we have previously undertaken targeted outreach and engagement activity in order to promote and encourage a wider range of applicants joining the police service. And indeed, where we have done so, we have seen some success, particularly in relation to gender representation and community background. I think it's fair to say that our key lever for changing the demographics and the composition of our workforce is external recruitment. So when that's paused or slowed down, our ability to improve representation is significantly reduced. We ran our last recruitment campaign in 2021, and we do have over 1,000 applicants and candidates on a merit list. So even should we need to start to intake more student officers, we already have candidates from that activity that we will be going to in the first instance. So I suppose I'm going a long-winded way saying it will be some time before we may need to do another external recruitment campaign. So I think that means that in the meantime, it's even more important that how we deliver our policing services, how we engage with the communities that we serve, and the diversity of those communities is our key way of building confidence in policing and encouraging people that policing is a challenging but rewarding career. And we want to have a diverse and inclusive workforce in order to do that to our best ability.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Trevor, for supplemental on this, please.
Probably back more to the main thrust of the point in terms of recruitment. I suppose in your opening remarks, you had referenced about the importance of neighbourhood, which we have all agreed on previously. Interesting today in terms of statistics about how much of that intelligence they're bringing in actually solves crime. And for most people that interact with the police, it's the constables they see. How do you balance, whenever you're talking about the tight controls, tight budgets, slowing down recruitment, looking at a state, and actually in your report this month, you're referring to a process for the chief supers, and I'm sure there are other processes for senior roles, whenever all of the stripping out seems to become at the constable end, or that's certainly what the public will see, and that's what they'll feel the most. So how do you square that circle?
With something, Trevor, we keep on the careful review. So Pamela last year marked through the resource allocation process, ran sort of exercises to look at ratios of, if you like, leaders to the people that they lead. So we're still an organisation that's a hierarchy that has blocks of teams. So I know the sort of hint behind the question is, do you need as many bosses? Because is it fair where you're making the cuts? But we still need sergeants to be team leaders at the front end, and we've just recently promoted some inspectors who are the tier above. But it is an issue we keep on the review, so that what we have in the middle is appropriate and prudent. But we also, in certain ranks that are legislatively linked, for example, the superintendent's role, need sufficient people either to authorise some of the things we were talking about in our previous meeting around surveillance, right through to sort of pace decisions around custody, or indeed firearms and public order operations where there are specific skill sets. So, and we need enough of those people to run the rotas, particularly over the busy summer months. But Pamela, Mark probably want to say a bit more.
The valid points, Trevor, and it does feel like a repeat on last year as well. I mean, if you actually consider out of the levers that there's various reasons why people will leave, but the vast majority are people approaching retirement and so forth. So actually for us, a number of the key people leaving are key roles and people with senior experience. So we then need to look across the organisation as to, that will also give us an evidence base of an element of promotion that will still happen. So in the main, there won't be the level of promotion that people have been used to, but we may need to promote people into key roles as we look into the year. So we do that, and we have undertaken the rank ratio again this year. It's a guide, it's a benchmark to try and keep things fairly standardised. But it is very much looking at, and Claire has been looking at this through the vacancy control panel, that we apply scrutiny to all those roles. A, the people that are leaving, and B, the roles that we will need to replace. And some of that may then require promotions to enable that. So it's not a case of a complete, 9,000 people, we will have movements in the organisation, but we do anticipate, based on this budget, that will dramatically slow down this year.
I'd just like to come back in terms of the model of the rank ratio. Whilst I understand it and appreciate it, I think whenever we were aspiring to 7,500 officers, that probably looked easier. But now that we're going to be sub 6,000, the rank ratio, I think, is disproportionate, or be more disproportionate for constables. So you can actually apply a percentage to this, that there is a ratio, but it disproportionately affect constables over more senior officers.
Yeah, go on. I'll just give an example, Claire, before I bring Claire. I ended up about 2 weeks ago in the late shift at Allamby on a Saturday. There was 5 people sat there. Now, that probably gives you some example of, the scale of what we're dealing with in response. And I was talking to them saying that all the things that we could do, that we talked to you today about IT, less bureaucracy, won't put a 6th, a 7th, or an 8th person on that seat. But even in your question, those 5, that might have been 8, still need a sergeant to run them, to do the briefings, to do the supervision. So some of this, even as we shrink, we can't always, because of geography, merge teams. In some other places, as we come back to as the year goes on, for example, a lot of our officers, obviously, as you know, Trevor, in local policing, there may be things we have to do at an area level, which sits above district, where you will get more harmonisation of roles, which will then probably see, for example, less people in certain ranks like inspector and chief inspector. So there will be a stage series of changes that will sort of work out at the other end. But do you want to come in, Claire?
I was just going to add, I suppose first and foremost, this is really difficult work, because it's our workforce who we want to keep engaged and valued throughout this challenging financial situation. In addition to considering, if you call it a scientific rank ratio approach, this year we will absolutely put in a layer of what I'm describing as a strategic overlay. So as an executive team, we've been discussing the core areas that we must, protect, or that are critically important for keeping people safe. So response, contact management, neighbourhood. So there'll be an element where it is not just the more blunt instruments that you've heard about around, rank ratio, but with some element of strategic testing, so that when we are considering what vacancies or what recruitment we need to do, that will be how we scrutinise them.
Okay, thank you. And Edgar, is a question on road deaths.
Thank you, Chief. And this, I think, touches on some of the issues we've talked about before. Significant upturn in the number of deaths in the first 5 months of this year, 30 compared to 12 the first 5 months last year, 16 the year before. So quite significant, and obviously with implications for family, friends, and indeed for PSNI as first responders with other colleagues. And the DCC has touched on this in response to Les's question. So 2 questions really. First of all, just to invite you to give your policing assessment of the recent rise in road traffic fatalities and serious collisions. And the second bit is the implications of budget cuts for road policing, appreciating that PSNI is only one piece of the jigsaw in relation to road safety. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgar. And yeah, a very contemporary question, because sadly at the moment hardly a day seems to pass without reading on our overnight summary of somebody else has tragically lost their lives in a collision. I'll bring Chris in to sort of answer the substance of this, because he's the lead for roads policing, but it also engages that other thing we've mentioned a few times today, Edgar. It is, where is the strategic oversight and the partnership working? We have a road safety partnership, which we'd like to see have more teeth. We previously made suggestions to the Department of Infrastructure about how that might work, looking at good practice elsewhere, because some of the tragedy is around error and driver behaviour, others is around engineering design, or sort of more sort of look about how we can get better enforcement using not just our infamous white vans, but sort of roadside enforcement you'd see in other parts of the UK to moderate driver behaviour. But Chris, do you want to come in with some of the specifics?
Thank you, Chief Chair, and thank you, Edgar, for raising such an important issue. It's a perennial problem that there are roughly twice as many fatalities on our roads every year as there are through homicide. So it is a significant issue and has been for some time. You're right to highlight the increase in fatalities of late. The statistics for last year saw an increase on the year before. That was 61 last year, so 30 already at this point. And tragically, another instance reported overnight you might be aware of seems unacceptable. So we are working very hard with partners. There's more we can do with the Road Safety Partnership, and we will keep pressing on those arrangements there through the partnership engagement that we have. Nationally, we talk about the fatal four contributing factors to road deaths and serious injuries. So those four are speeding, use of devices such as mobile phones, impairment through use of drugs or alcohol, and failure to use seatbelts correctly. Our analysis from last year, specifically here in Northern Ireland, didn't counter any of that, but actually identified one of our largest contributory factors to be inattention. So arguably there's a fatal 5 in Northern Ireland, and we need to pay more attention to tackling inattention from drivers and road users. So we are engaging in a number of developments in some of those key areas. So speeding, for example, we saw an increase in the number of prosecutions last year. It rose to 62,000 thereabouts through use of the enforcement cameras, which is really important to tackle speeding on the roads. In terms of impairment, drink driving has obviously been a focus of ours for a long time. You'll have heard through the board recently developments that are ongoing to introduce roadside testing for drug use for drivers as well, and hopefully we'll see progress on that over the course of the year. And in terms of that inattention, so we've recently, from the 15th of May, introduced a system to deal with careless driving through use of fixed penalty notices. So that means that we can be more efficient and more effective. It's been a challenge for officers to deal with careless driving. This is a much slimlined means of dealing with that, and means that we can be more effective in the enforcement of that area, which is absolutely critical to saving lives on our roads in Northern Ireland. So those are the key areas that we're focusing on. The second part of your question was around implications of budget cuts. Being more efficient and effective in those areas will help us deal with budget cuts, but it's right to highlight that we have had to reduce the number of officers who are dedicated to roads policing as a result of the shrinking workforce. So we've seen a reduction of about 21 officers on our establishment. But in response to that, we've reorganised the way that we operate. So we had a slightly siloed approach to roads policing, and we've brought those teams together to tackle the strategic road network more effectively. And with the introduction of these new policy changes, such as fixed penalty notices, we can be more efficient and hopefully drive the deaths and serious injuries on our roads down again.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Frank now on drug deaths.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. We are witnessing a significant rise in drug-related deaths. In January this year, we saw an unprecedented 17 drugs or suspected drug-related. The 17 is roughly equivalent to everybody sitting in front of you, and about half of all those sitting behind you. Are these shocking numbers from Northern Ireland being replicated across the rest of the UK and in Europe? My second part is, what's the PSNI doing to save these lives? And the final part is, given the role that others, agencies and bodies and everyone can play, are you satisfied, or the PSNI satisfied, that there's sufficient forces and energy in helping you address this issue?
Thank you. Well, again, you highlight another issue around lost lives and sort of some of the lived experience here, isn't it? Obviously, we may touch on this a bit later with Graham, with his obviously his tackling drug importation hat on, and some of the patterns of crime in that space, both through sort of traditional illegal drugs. We have a specific issue, as you know, about misuse of prescription drugs, and then there's new emerging types. You'll see only recently, I think, in the news in America, some quite grim scenes from some of the big cities about synthetic drugs that are causing all sorts of problems. We do obviously have both a enforcement response, which I'll bring Mark in a minute to touch on, and also the neighbourhood policing footprint, if you want, with Bobby, is particularly evident when we see concerns in Belfast city centre. I have personally met with the chief executive in Belfast to sort of look at how we can better manage the public realm, because it does, some of the scenes you will see there are both disturbing and off-putting, and it doesn't really chime with, for example, tourism aspirations and such like. But I think, to be entirely candid, Frank, I think that this is not necessarily a policing issue. This is a wider societal and health issue. It's about policy, again, which goes back to my point and plea for Community Safety Board. This is where these bigger issues should be put on the table and some more joined up thinking done across different sectors to come up with some sustainable answers, which was Mark's point earlier, rather than just short-term snap initiatives that might move a problem off the streets for a while, then it reappears. Because endemically, we know some of the lived experience and trauma here presents different patterns of risk. But if you want, I'll bring Mark in to talk about some of our own enforcement. And it's through yourself, Chair, where you want to speak to Graham now, or pause till his slot soon.
Well, you can give a comment now. That's okay.
Yeah, well, I'll quickly cover the specific point about the comparability with the rest of the UK. So, I mean, you referred to statistics from January, that the formal statistics we have quite a lag on them in terms of drug deaths. So they're from 2021 rather than 2022 stats come out this summer. But if you use the 2021 stats, the proportion of drugs deaths per population in Northern Ireland is a bit less than double England and Wales. So it is higher, but it's about a third of what it is in Scotland. So Scotland has a massive problem. About 25 people out of 100,000 died in 2021 from drug deaths. It's about 9.4 in Northern Ireland, about 5 in England and Wales. And then within England and Wales, it varies massively. So in the northeast, they've got a significant problem. It's much less, although drug consumption is high in London, drug deaths in London is lower. But I would echo Simon's points about it, about being there a massive kind of socioeconomic and public health issue to it. The difference in deaths doesn't appear to us to be a consequence of different enforcement or police action. It is the different socioeconomic background in the different regions and areas around the UK. I'll leave it there. Mark, come in.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, so in short, we're seizing more drugs and disrupting more organised crime groups, whether they're paramilitary or OCGs, than ever before. So if we look at the last year and there's sort of two strands to this for us. There's the neighbourhood policing uniform response at low level street dealing. And in the last year, there's been almost 900 or 9,000 drug seizure incidents recorded, over 3,000 arrests, and over 8,000 drug offence outcomes for the same period. At the high level, we have had 282 arrests, 344 people reported charged, well over £9 million worth of drugs seized. And indeed, our frustrations, disruptions, and dismantling of OCGs we're up 55% in terms of search. We're up 40% in terms of drug seizures, 16% in terms of people charged, and disruptions are up 30%, frustrations are up 115%. So we are doing more in the enforcement space, along with partners in the NCA, UK Border Force, and Garda Síochána, than in terms of drug importation than ever before. Where we are seeing the drugs deaths is in polydrug use. So this is prescription drugs, a mix of drugs that people are ingesting, and that is generally what is behind the cause, and it's vulnerable people who are involved in chaotic lifestyles. So that's where we start to look to what's the public health approach to this. So the only way you remove this risk is by supporting those people and taking away the demand. A lot of that polydrug use, a lot of the supply is through the postal system. We've ran up Mobiliser in Belfast that we've talked to the board about before. We've worked very closely again between C1 organised crime and Belfast district to tackle both ends of it, the street dealing. We've worked closely with Fast Parcel Service and Royal Mail to carry out the drug intercepts that are being delivered through the Postal Service. And we've worked with the Coroner's Office and Public Health around victimology. What are the types of drugs that people are taking? What are those lifestyles, to try and refer people into the multi-agency support hubs and others, other intervention pathways at an earlier stage. But that is the key to this, is about joining up where we are with health, with other agencies, and trying to intervene earlier and provide rehabilitation services to people who are involved in drug consumption.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Is okay.
Can I just come in? Yep,
just
absolutely. That was, I think, the last part of my question was about what other agencies, bodies, and that, and the level of support you're getting from them, and the level of support you need from them. We can maybe pick this up the other side.
Thank you. Mike has a question on drug and food in Newton Ards.
Chair, thank you. I'd appreciate an update on the situation in Newton Ards, Simon. And also, if I may, in terms of your assessment of the provisional IRA, there was a 2015 assessment. I'm wondering whether you are sticking with that because you have reassessed since 2015, or whether 2015 is the last assessment.
So do it in two halves. Shall I bring Bobby in just to deal with Newton Ards, and we'll come back to the second one?
Okay, Mike, thanks for the question. Firstly, let me reassure you and the board that this remains a public safety priority for local policing and an investigative priority for the Paramilitary Crime Task Force. In fact, Mark may want to say a bit specifically about what's happening in terms of the investigation after I've provided my update. So to date, there have been 140 incidents now linked to this criminal feud, albeit we have seen a lower frequency in recent weeks, but there have still been a number of incidents during the month of May. We had a viable pipe bomb located outside a house in Newton Ards on Friday the 12th of May at around 11 o'clock. This resulted in a number of homes having to be evacuated. Then on the 21st of May, there was an arson attack that took place at a taxi office in High Street in Bangor, where accelerant was poured through the door of the property. And then on the 22nd of May, there were a series of incidents in Newton Ards that you'll likely be aware of, which resulted in a property being extensively damaged by a petrol bomb. And then we had 3 vehicles damaged at 2 other addresses. The inquiries are all ongoing in respect of these incidents. In terms of the public safety operation, it continues with high visibility patrols by neighbourhood policing teams, but we're also continuing to utilise the specialist capability of Chris's people. So we're using the likes of the armed response units, the TSGs, and of course, working very closely with Mark's people in the Paramilitary Crime Task Force. I'd just like to take the opportunity again to thank the public, in particular Newton Ards, for their support to the policing operation over the last number of months, and just to take the opportunity to appeal to anyone to come forward with information to the police. And if they don't feel comfortable talking to us, they can, of course, go through the Independent Crime Stoppers charity on 0800 555 111.
Yeah, and the second half, Mike, 2015 is the last assessment. I'll bring Mark in though, just to give you a bit more background.
So in terms of higher, that is the last assessment we've had. No reason to vary from that. We have had assessments on the threat level. We've said publicly that we know that former members of Provisional IRA have become involved either in organised criminality or in migrated to other violent dissident Republican groups. As you know, that the threat assessment from MI5 has moved to severe in Northern Ireland. That's an assessment primarily focused on the capability and capacity of violent dissident Republican groups, such as Continuity IRA or New IRA.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to Kate now with 2 questions on services for young people and arrests of young people as well. Thank you.
Okay. We have a service for young people where communication may need to be adapted to meet their needs. And I'm just wondering how often the PSNI have used the registered intermediary service for young people or vulnerable adults under the age of 25. If you can break these down by year, month or suite, that's great, but any detail is welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Bobby's got some detail. I think some of the specifics we probably need a sort of time for a written answer because it's quite detailed, and some of it I think we might not be able to answer because we just don't collect the data in terms of the sort of what happens in terms of after the call process. So, but Bobby, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Chief, and thanks, Kate, for the question. So apologies in advance. Bits of this will be somewhat rudimentary. The figures in terms of the intermediary service have been obtained by us from the Department of Justice, and they indicate that there were around 1,055 requests for the scheme in total, of which about 697 related to persons under the age of 18. Now, I know in your question you'd asked for persons under 25, but unfortunately the way the DOJ collect the information, it's not possible to break the figures down in that way. In terms of the second question you'd asked, and it was in two parts. The first element that you'd asked was around how many young people aged under 18 have been arrested in the last 3 years, and what proportion of the arrests led to the young person being found guilty of breaking the law. As the Chiefs explained, that's quite difficult. Our systems don't necessarily join up to be able to tell us what criminal justice outcomes were. And the only way really we could do that is through a very extensive and labour intrusive trawl against every single arrest. And because of the length of time that the criminal justice process takes, you'd have to go back over many, many years, and you still wouldn't actually have the full picture, again, because there'd be a number of cases outstanding. So regrettably, we can't answer that element of the question. The second element that you had asked about, however, was about the number of young people that were being charged to court. And the figures that we have, and I would stress that these are operational figures, not validated statistics, but they would indicate that in the last 3 years, there was a total of around 3,709 young people under 18s who were charged. Oh, sorry, there was a total of 3,709 under 18s who were arrested. 836 of those were charged, which is around 23%. But again, I would stress that outside of charges, there are a number of other disposals that could affect young people leaving custody. I suspect that the question is really about the criminalisation of young people. If I can take that liberty, you're nodding, which is reassuring for me. Just to reassure yourself, and of course, members of the board will be aware that this month we're going to be launching our children and young persons strategy. And a key focus of that strategy is to make sure that we do everything that we can to make sure that criminalisation of young people is an absolute last resort. And we look forward to launching that strategy in the coming weeks, along with the board.
Okay, Kate, is that okay? Thank you. Okay, and we have a question from Joanne on the extraction from neighbourhood.
Thank you very much, Chair. Again, some of this has been touched on, but let me just get my notes on it. Chief, I want to first of all commend you on the work that you've done on the budget so far. I appreciate that it's been a massive ask, and we fully appreciate that you've had really difficult decisions to make. I think it's important that we put that on the record. In your report and today verbally, you reaffirmed your commitment to neighbourhood, and that's really welcome. We understand the importance of that to communities. We know the difference it makes to the service. But as you have said yourself, and as we've heard on multiple occasions, neighbourhood frequently express frustration with the levels of extraction. That means they're not actually able to do the work that they would really love to be engaged in. So in the course of your earlier remarks, you outlined some of the types of things that you're considering, but you'll appreciate that the public's expectations now need to be managed in accordance with the resources that you've got and the choices you have to make. You talked about a dramatic reconfiguration. Could you give us some indication as to what that might look like and what the differences may be, please, between neighbourhood now and neighbourhood in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, well, firstly, what will stay the same is, as I said earlier, Joanne, a universal service across the country, so that every part of Northern Ireland, we want to aim to still have a neighbourhood policing team that polices it and covers it. What will be up for grabs, which is the detail that Bobby is working on at the moment, is that the sort of size of teams in certain places versus the physical geography they will cover, because you know yourself that we tend to have bigger teams in the urban areas because that's where a lot of the work is, but then you have to balance that between also the need for visibility in the rural areas where just sheer distance to travel and turn up is difficult. So it's how we balance the two. At the moment, we've been working a service that operates 7 days a week, sort of largely 16 hours a day. You can see we're going to have to make choices about shifting that to maybe just one shift a day around key times that is sort of intelligence or demand pattern led. And similarly, you know, I suppose I share in a sense underneath the question, the frustration that you don't go far to meet neighbourhood officers that want to do more with the community, and then they think they're going to an event around crime prevention and they're suddenly rostered to cover duties on the front gate or something like that. So we're trying to say to commanders, you've got permission to not do some of the back office stuff, to keep the neighbourhood officers doing where the public wants to see them, be that, you know, marshalling people to carry out drugs enforcement right through to some of the other stuff. But I think where we've been talking, Bobby and I and the wider team, is about how you maintain the commitment to problem solving, prevention and early intervention, and then where you might have to push off other work. So that will take across the summer to come up with some key proposals. But if you think at the height, when Mark started this work, actually, we had in the region of 700 neighbourhood officers. I think we're making a planning assumption that it will drop to something like 250. And we'll have to manage that across the country in different ways. But that will be a gradual decline on the likely trajectory, because when you factor into this, the number of officers we need to do the 999 response across the shift pattern, which is also itself being reviewed. That's the first basis you've got to get right. That then triggers who else can do, if you like, overt uniform patrol, because we've also got some tough decisions to make. When you look at the pace of investigations that Mark and his colleagues have been working on in the crime side, it's wrestling those two issues. So what we have committed to as a team, which again, as I said to the chair earlier, has to go through our own governance, is that whatever that number is, if we can eke more out, we will. So it might end up being 350. I know, let's wait and see. But an absolute commitment that other than extremists, maybe New Year's Eve and the 12th of July, they will not be abstracted. And we'll be saying to ops planners, if you have to find 5 people for a parade or to search a house, find them from some of the back office roles that we still do.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, supplemental on this?
Just very quickly, I wasn't going to come in, but when you imagine 700 neighbourhood going down to 250, then that's a bit of a shock. I mean, at the core of all of it, you said this yourself, said the intelligence, 2/3 intelligence, even crime ops coming. But I mean, is this planned to go from 700 down to 250? And if it is, could you explain that? I mean, I can understand that, as you explained earlier, with the retirements, with the force getting less. But if we say in the first instance that the core is neighbourhood, I know you used the term, I think it was universal. I have to say that frightens me a wee bit, because when people say we have a universal force, it's too broad. It doesn't describe what we're dealing with. So could you explain a wee bit more just on that 700 to 250? Because I do think that's hugely, it could be at least hugely damaging to policing.
I think firstly, Jack, I don't disagree that the carries with you raising it sort of goes against most of my own sort of bias and sort of prejudice within policing, if you like, operationally, because it's not to sort of denigrate other functions. Where Chris was talking before, you know, that an officer that turns up to a road death, it's a pretty grim scene, right through to some of the tenacious work that some of the investigators we see. But what we're assuming that is a working assumption. It's not the as is position. But if the reality is that without dramatic input to our budget, we've said before that for every year that we see officers decline, it will take 3 years to get us back to where we were on the sliding scale. So the trajectory at the moment is that we're seeing more people leave than we're even now anticipating. But we've been given pretty clear instruction that we cannot sort of commit to any sort of further spend until we balance the books. So the gap at the moment is still an unfunded 43 million pound gap. So as much as I might like to sort of press a lever and say recruit so we can sustain neighbourhood policing, where we get this tension between the Policing Act duties and my duties as accounting officer creates this rub. So where we may get to with the work that Bobby is doing is less people, but it will be a gradual decline and reallocation of resource. So it may be in certain parts of the country where you might have 3 teams covering a place out of a police station, it may be merged into one. And similarly, we've got to look at where risk is higher. We're also looking with the Northern Ireland office about how we might be able to use the additional security fund differently. Because if you go back to those earlier comments about where we see intelligence coming from the community, can we make an argument to the Northern Ireland office to sort of fund neighbourhood teams in some of the areas where we still see there's pockets of dissident Republican activity where we want to stay ahead of it, because we can see a correlation there between increased visibility, improved reporting for the public, and the action that Mark Teams is trying to say. So it's not that we put the white flag up and are giving up, but we're just trying to see how we get to that figure. And if we can keep it at higher levels prudently, we will do, but we are managing many competing issues, because the assumption soon will be this year we'll see further loss. We're now sort of just shy of 665. We may soon be at nearly 6,000. And as Trevor hinted at, without help, it may decline further, because we don't even know in the medium term, will we have sufficient funds to pay for pay awards and stuff like that. So that these are pretty grim decisions, and we're not making them easily, but we have to be honest with people that until we get that clarity, that we see further reductions and decline. But we just want to commit to that, whatever it ends up looking like, we'll have to consult with the public, we'll have to have dialogue with yourselves, and also we've got to engage our own workforce, because we've invested heavily in problem solving training and other things where, only recently, I think Bobby and I have been at the problem solving awards, I think. So, like you can see the commitments there to do this well, but we do have to balance a range of competing interests. So I don't disagree, this is stark and difficult, but we are sort of stuck on the numbers.
Right, just very briefly. Thanks for that, Chief. And just as I have this here in my head, so this is to do with the budget that you have, what it is planned. So you're reckoning, I mean, if I may be political for a moment, we have a government now which is austerity government. So if resources increase, does that mean this goes back up again, or in the future? So you aren't planning this is the new policing service that needs less.
I mean, in a sense, if I could sort of go back to the future and rewire the clock, as it were, I'd want to be at the levels where Mark was doing this 2 years ago, 700 officers. And if we get beyond that, more, because there's an insatiable clamour for police officers and those public facing local roles. But
I mean, without being clinical, but on the trajectory towards 7,500, it was on basis of growing neighbourhood policing. So I mean, up to recently, our whole plan had been to grow this organisation and grow the community effort, but also put sufficient investment into areas of serious criminality. Mark has this is a burgeoning area around vulnerability and serious criminality and domestic violence that also needs detective support. And we can't statutorily avoid that. In practical terms, I mean, Bobby can confirm that neighbourhoods running at about 500-ish at the minute now, because with abstractions, and then we haven't been able to fill numbers for quite a while. If we get to this, I'm going to pick a number, 350, 250, but what we want to do is then say that those officers, and we might be held hostage to this, that they don't do anything but neighbourhood policing. So, the aspiration would be a smaller group of people, but whose role is entirely ring fenced to neighbourhood policing, give or take one or two small areas, whereas at the minute they're subject to the nature of the service. But it is, Jerry, it's entirely based upon the fact that the headcount is rapidly diminishing, and the chief, to be fair to him, I think has been wrestling with the team on this for many months now. But the practicalities are the numbers just don't exist.
Okay, thank you very much. For now, Chief, I'm just going to move over to Graham. You're very, very welcome. And just to say, Director General, thank you for your report. There's provides a vast amount of information on the work of the agency, and just to commend in terms of the 6 million drugs seizure at Belfast Port as well. But we have some questions if you would like to take some additional opening remarks, and then we've 3 or 4 questions from some of our members. So over to yourself.
Even better to be heard. Yes. So no, it's great to be here. So thank you for inviting me again. I do consider these sessions to be a really important part of what we do around the UK, is being accountable to you here in the NIPB. So kind of conscious of time, I could say more and maybe leave some of that for questions. I'm getting a clear nod there. Okay, so I'm quite happy in questions to talk about how the overall threat, rather than just in Northern Ireland, has changed over since I was last here 6 months ago, if that's helpful. But I won't do that now, just for time. One thing we have kind of done since I was last here is produced our kind of new 5-year strategy. So just as a quick summary of that, and it's based on our analysis of a threat. we have decided that we need to push our efforts more into the very highest end of high harm, which is where we've always partly been, but we've drifted down a bit. And we need to be focusing on tackling organised crime, what we call upstream, overseas, and online. And by upstream, we don't mean, internationally. We mean going for the kingpins that are running organised crime groups, the enablers who are the nodes that are key to those organised crime groups surviving, rather than just individual foot soldiers. So that is the way we are trying to shift the agency's efforts. You would have seen an element of that reflected in the report. So you would have seen that we break disruptions down into major, moderate, and minor in terms of the impact that they have. And the minor disruptions have actually gone down slightly, but the major and the moderate ones have gone up. And that is quite deliberate from us. We are trying to push into making a bigger impact with potentially fewer, but more important disruptions. And the thesis behind that is that going for those will have more impact overall. So fewer, bigger disruptions will have more impact on reducing organised crime and the harm that it brings. When I was here last, Simon and I briefly talked about us sitting back and thinking about the NCA's role here and how we best play into with PSNI into Northern Ireland. And we have done some work on that, and we have refocused around three areas that we have agreed on. And one of them is identifying who the highest value targets are in Northern Ireland, the most serious criminals, the people driving the most harm in the community, and then making sure that between us we are focusing our resources on them. Secondly, we are going to re-energise work we are doing on for the UK as a whole on fugitives. So one of the things that the NCA does is have liaison officers all around the world. One of the things we can do is pursue anyone for whom there is an arrest warrant out around the world, whether it's on a serious and organised crime or any other crime at all. And we've been quite successful in doing that for some forces. We want to reinvigorate our work with PSNI so that we can do more to bring back criminals that Simon and team have got a warrant out for, and bring them back to face justice in Northern Ireland. And the third thing that we are doing is bolstering our efforts with the paramilitary crime task force, and particularly the use of our civil recovery powers, not only, but anything we can use on that. You'll have seen one example of that last week or the week before, when we got a property freezing order on a bit of land at Blackwater Town worth about £100,000. So that is an early indication of what we are trying to do, and there will be, if we are successful, more of that coming. So that is about using every tool we can in our toolkit to try and disrupt crime from wherever it comes. You mentioned already the seizure of about £6 million worth of cannabis, so about a third of a ton in Belfast Port coming in over from GB. That is obviously part of our role. It speaks to Frank's question earlier on about what we are doing around drugs. And that will absolutely involve investigating people in Northern Ireland, but as important, people outside Northern Ireland, but who are bringing drugs into Northern Ireland. That being one example. Another was a conviction that we got about 2 weeks ago on someone we arrested in Liverpool with 10 kilograms of heroin. It's a much smaller amount, but heroin obviously causing an awful lot of harm. We arrested them in February. They pled guilty a couple of weeks ago. That was a Northern Ireland individual, but in Liverpool at the time. And then, of course, we are focused on GB criminals who are trying to import drugs into Northern Ireland. So we've had some good results on that in the last 2 quarters. I'm conscious of time. You will have a series of questions. I can pick up on lots of detail around any of those areas if helpful. Thanks, Jake.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Brendan first for a first question.
Thank you, Chair. In the Q4 report, it refers to in Northern Ireland 55 organised crime groups, and against them there were 203 actions to frustrate those crime groups and 23 to disrupt. And I suppose picking up on
what Graham said in relation to identifying the highest value targets. What I'm interested in is, in terms of that activity, how much of it is really opportunistic and intelligence led, and how much of it is actually part of a targeted strategy to dismantle organised crime groups. And then as a second question, of those 55 organised crime groups in Northern Ireland, how many are on a shortlist for being dismantled? And what's your best guess as to your success in the coming year of actually dismantling them?
I'll start and then hand over to Simon. So, I mean, it's a mixture of opportunistic and targeted. Inevitably, we'll take opportunities as they arrive. But part of what we are doing is to try to move to be much clearer about who the people causing the most harm are, and then have a plan around each of them. And we've set up a process between us so that we can task that work and make sure we are kind of investigating it proactively. But Simon might want to pick up.
Yeah, I think it's probably, I'm trying to think back, this might be before you joined us, Brendan, that we've had a few discussions about the community frustration of who you see driving around in bling cars and going on to posh holidays, and effectively what we're doing about it. So there's some of the conversations that both Graham and I have had, as has Mark, one of our chief superintendents, and then senior colleagues from NCA. So we're looking at a range of interventions where we use the tactics that best fit the problem. And as Graham said, some of it is opportunistic. If intelligence comes in, we'll act quick to it. But equally, there's a more longer term strategy, which Mark is building with colleagues. So I'll bring Mark in just to give some flavours around that. And it's probably best maybe for a partnership meeting to give me more, something like that, to give you more detail. But do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I think it is a blend. And if we look at, so within the police service, who owns the OCGs and the paramilitary groups that we have, some will be still sitting with intelligence in terms of intelligence development. Some will be proactively being led by PCTF and OCTF, Paramilitary Crime Task Force and Organised Crime Task Force, along with the NCA and other agencies. And then some will be owned at neighbourhood level, at local policing level, through Op Connexus that we've talked about previously. All of that is around both the continual attrition we can enact at local level to try and deal with the harm that's being caused at local level, right up to the intelligence-led proactive work between the organised crime branch, C1, and NCA. And then even within that, there will be elements where not necessarily opportunistic in the way you might imagine, but nominals who are connected to that might come to police attention for another reason. And again, our organised crime branch would then start to take that on as another way of getting into that. We are moving to the Atmos system. That brings us on board with the rest of the UK. It focuses more on harm rather than the frustrate, dismantle CrimNet system that we have. It gives us and NCA more visibility of what each agency is doing around who, and it deals primarily with harm. So that will move us forward massively in the next year.
Just a quick extra for Brendan on that. We just also need to approach all of this with a degree of humility. So we can identify what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And one of the conclusions we've had to reach from the work we did with European partners on the EncroChat criminal device system, where we suddenly had a massive insight into criminals that we hadn't had before, where there were people we just didn't know were operating. So we can have a figure of 55 or whatever it is. That won't be the right figure. So we have to have some humility about that. Still go after them, of course, but that isn't going to be the totality. And then secondly, one way that criminals have evolved really in the last kind of 10 years is to be less based around very strict hierarchical OCGs that you can kind of put your hands around and go, there's the boss and here's the structure and this is how it works. And then you can have a plan against that. We see more evolving kind of networks of people that are quite fluid. And so we need to be a bit more sophisticated about how we try and attack that. So it's not necessarily, if we can identify who is the person at the very top, it's the nodes in that system, which if we can attack and dismantle will have the biggest effect on the overall network.
Thank you for that. Janet, you had a quick question on Atmos as well, just quickly. I noticed you referenced that earlier.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Director General and Chiefy. Chief Constable and team. Yes, Mark had just briefly mentioned there the Atmos system. I know it's very new with PSNI, and just wondering how long has it been in operation at the NCA, and what sort of level of success are you having, for example, in cybercrime with the joined up interagency approach? And does the system allow for enhanced reporting? Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. So I don't actually know off the top of my head exactly when we brought it into the NCA, but it's been a number of years now, and we've been gradually rolling it out to other law enforcement bodies, both police forces and more broadly. It's part of our effort, which is really important, to try and make sure that we are pulling together a completely coherent understanding of our collective intelligence picture around intelligence, the investigations that we have going on, and then the results that come out of them. And there was an NAO report, National Audit Office report, a number of years ago that said that collectively we just didn't have that understanding. And if we don't have that understanding, how can we be sure that we are being effective in tackling it? So it's fundamental to get that data right. So we have pulled that together, and it is helping. So it's helping us at the kind of national level, having an understanding, and the feedback from forces that are already on it, and it is new for PSNI, is it's really helping them too in seeing the bigger picture within which they are operating. Do you want me to pick up on the cyber question too? Did we? Yeah. Sorry. So yeah. I mean, yes, we include cyber in that. We've got a parallel system called TICAT that we use to task cyber activity across the whole system. It's still registered on ATMIS too. The cyber threat generally has not gone up over the last 6 months or a year. We still see ransomware as the biggest single element of that, and there's been at least one attack in Northern Ireland since I've been last here that we've supported PSNI on dealing with it. Our response to the high-end cybercrime, but actually all cybercrime in the way it bleeds into fraud as well, and online fraud, is to increasingly go after the ecosystem. Now, we absolutely want to tackle the main individuals, an awful lot of whom are based overseas, but there is a whole ecosystem that supports them, and that's the work then that we have been doing with the FBI and other Five Eyes partners and the Germans and the Dutch in trying to take down some of the big sites online that are selling tools and selling data, and if we can do that, that then really cuts the legs out of some of the cyber criminals.
Okay, thank you, Ren. Thank you, Janet. Okay, I'm going to go to Mukesh and then Nuala, and then a quick question from Trevor, but Mukesh, please.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Constable and Director General, this is probably something that both of you could give input into. The PSNI and the Paramilitary Crime Task Force continue to demonstrate huge inroads into interventions, frustrations, seizures of drugs, etc. All of the good work that you're doing, which is very commendable. And Mark, you alluded to a number of those things earlier on. My question is, I guess, should the PSNI not be doing more to make the public aware of all of that good work? First of all, to increase public confidence. Secondly, to act as a deterrent. And when I look at the NCA website on the homepage, it's right in your face, listing from the smallest to the biggest gains that have taken place. Whereas I think on the PSNI website, there's sufficient, you have to hunt for it. I think it's important from a public point of view to realize what exactly you're doing, specifically because there's a lack of confidence in some quarters because of the resources that your resource issues that you're coming up against.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose principally one for us, Mukesh. I think we try really hard to get, if you like, real-time information out when arrests are made. Sometimes we sit back for operational reasons. There's a lag between a search and announcing it because we might be doing other searches or after other people. Mark will know that we frequently say, have we done the social media? So it is, I think we recognise that we want to get messaging out either through traditional means, and obviously we've got some media here today, but increasingly the conversations we're having inside is actually how we generate not just a sort of 2-line tweet or something that says we've done it, but other forms of media to tell our own story, more on their conversations we're having at the moment. But we are pretty consistent that if there is an arrest, there is follow-up social media, follow-up outbound media for the public. So I don't think there's many we've actually missed, Mark. So we can have a look at it and see if there's presentational issues that we can learn from. But I looked at the NCA website last night, and obviously it's put together slightly differences to ours because we've also got to allow bandwidth actually on the site. The site changes actually because of the way it's built now to reflect public inquiry. So that you'll see on there's reporting sort of arms as well as the news feeds, which I think we're particularly talking about. So we've actually invested quite a lot in how the site actually works. And that might be something that, again, we can come to a committee and get Jenny, who's been doing the work, to explain how we see the site evolving to give information. But increasingly, as you know, most people are just getting information straight off the phone, and it's how we keep that in the public consciousness as well.
Thank you.
Chair, could I maybe make one comment? So it is interesting, and the comparison's interesting. Obviously, policing covers a very broad range, as we've talked about here today, from very localized issues. But maybe one I could push back a little on, because we do push, there's a lot of this on social media in terms of advocacy, in terms of, sadly, there's a dichotomy between what's in the public interest and what the public are interested in. So where we in this room would think that everybody in Northern Ireland would be keenly interested in this, where it doesn't immediately affect some people's lives, actually there's not that level of interest. So I suppose my plea to the board would be, how do we increase that, and how do we develop and build that to show the successes that we are having?
Yeah, thank you very much. Nuala, your question on child exploitation.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just have a few questions for both NCI and PSNI officers. Just the first one, I'll combine them all. The first one, is child sexual abuse is the highest threat area with the highest proportion of disruptions. And I just want to know why that remains the case. Also, though, there was a prediction by the NCA that the Child Internet Protection Team referrals would have an increase. But we haven't yet seen that. And I know that there are queries about that, but I just wondered if you could give us an update here today, why that hasn't actually manifested and whether that will be going forward. I also had a question with regard to the number, and before I ask this, I must also welcome the number of arrests that were made. With this work between the NCA and PSNI, particularly, it was in Q4, 13 arrests, I believe, and 49 children safeguarded. So I think that should be congratulated, and those efforts obviously are most welcome by everyone on the board and indeed the public too, who take child safety as one of their highest priorities. There's 30 children currently identified at risk, and Mark will know that I've asked before about the number of those that are in care, because it does help us then to also hold to account social services as to what's going on there. So if you can answer those three, that would be appreciated.
Sure, thanks, Nuala. Yeah, and the figures you mentioned were for the last quarter. So for the last 6 months, it's 32 arrests in Northern Ireland on the back of the disseminations we've given. There may well have been others in addition, and 97 children safeguarded. Each of those obviously just absolutely vital. Is it the highest threat? Well, it's the area where we have contributed the most. If you look across our overall activity across the UK, we have more disruptions on drugs actually than child sexual abuse, but in the way we play into Northern Ireland, it has been more on the child sexual abuse, and that's partly because we are driving a big machine with the US and the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, in the US, that takes reports from social media companies, and then we can do work on that to try and identify who is looking for child sexual imagery online and disseminate those out to forces. And we do find, sadly, a correlation between those who are viewing material, indecent images of children online, and those who are committing contact abuse as well. So it is really important we do that. We are concerned that there will be a significant reduction in those reports, which come in the millions. They are very significant numbers, as the social media companies, and particularly Meta at the moment, move to put more of their services into an end-to-end encrypted view, which means the companies themselves will not be able to run algorithms over the material that's on their systems. and therefore they won't be able to put reports into NECMEC, and we won't be able to take action. That's obviously an issue we are raising, and politicians both here and other countries are raising with Meta all the time. On the CIPT point you raised, sorry, just not to miss that, you're quite right. We forecast that was going to increase. It hasn't yet. It's partly in the way we are dealing with the reports that are coming in with NECMEC. We've got to do a bit more analysis on them, it turns out, than we had previously, so that we can identify the most important there, kind of triage them, because we get so many, and the ones that really look like there's harm at risk of being committed, and where we can get to a location, which is fundamental. Otherwise, it's nothing we can do with it. So we've had to do a bit more work, and that has meant that it's been a bit slower to get the increase that we had foreseen, but we do think that will come in the next few weeks.
Just on CIPT, Chair.
Sorry.
Chair, can I just add on CIPT? So whilst in this reporting period it hasn't increased, and it takes us back to our resourcing conversation. So since the team was set up somewhere in around the mid-teens and around 2015, it has, we will get you the exact figures, but it has increased something like fourfold in terms of the referrals we get and the searches that we therefore have to carry out through local CID. So whilst in this snapshot it hasn't increased, I think that's what the board need to hold in their mind when we look at tension around where we put our resources.
Okay, thank you. I think, John, you have an extension question to this? Go ahead.
It was to Mark and Kieran about the 30 children identified at risk. If we could have for future, just if you're able to get that breakdown of those who actually do have a care order in place, because it does assist us in holding to account the trusts as well with our obligations, because I have raised time and again, it's not just a PSNI obligation here.
I think we need to take this discussion off the table, Chair, around who holds that information and the discussion with the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland.
Yeah. You're happy enough with that, Nuala? That's fine. Okay. John, you an extension question?
Yeah, sure, thank you. And moving more directly to criminal exploitation of young people, the recent media reports have shown that in the calendar year 2022, there were 9 arrests of young persons 16 and under for drugs offences, including intent to supply. Of those 9, 3 were aged 15 and 2, it's reported, were aged 14. So can I ask what measures are being taken on an interagency basis, firstly between NCA and police, and then with other agencies to protect those young people against that criminal exploitation, but then also beyond that to catch those who are exploiting them through paramilitary gangs and organised crime gangs?
I'm happy to start on the kind of national picture. So we absolutely do see this. So we capture this under modern slavery and human trafficking. We get something like 7,000 reports through that national referral mechanism of people who could be modern slaves, and about half of those are children. The majority kind of criminal exploitation. So they are being used in what certainly in England we're talking about as county lines at the moment. So they are being used to run drugs. And so yes, absolutely, sometimes they are arrested, but they are also victims. And there's been a really good effort actually, and the Met Police have led this rather than the NCA, to really try and get inside the county lines system, penetrate the phones that have been used to run it, and try and drive down on the people who are organising it. As ever, we need a dose of humility in how we think about that. So there have been lots of lines, the phone lines disrupted. There have been lots of people arrested and children as a result safeguarded. But if the demand is there for the drugs, and it is a pretty inelastic demand, and Simon touched on this earlier, then new people will be recruited, new lines will be set up, and it continues. So it plays back. It seems to be one of the themes from your questions and our response actually is across lots of threats, is the importance of partnership working right across, not largely public sector, but actually beyond that too.
Okay, thank you. The last question from Trevor.
Thank you. Chief, you made reference when we were talking about, when you said earlier about, I think it was in response to the unexplained wealth orders, you talked about the big cars. I mean, you hear the terminology, the dogs on the street. I suppose maybe more directed at Graham. You did in your response earlier on, you talked about £100,000 piece of land. I suppose for me, actually, over the last 3 years, how many unexplained wealth orders have been used in Northern Ireland and to what value? Because I think there's nothing more tangible to the public as seeing people who don't work, don't hold down proper jobs, but have these expensive holidays, nice houses and fancy cars. And if they were visibly used more frequently, then I think it would give people more confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely agree. So it's either 2 or 3 UWOs in relation to Ireland that we've had. But we've only had 5 UWOs in total across the whole of the UK. Now, that's because the UWOs themselves, they've attracted an enormous amount of kind of political attention and interest. They've kind of captured the public's imagination, but they're quite niche in what they can target. So what you are really wanting and we are really wanting is that we can go after the assets of criminals, and we use civil powers like UWOs when we can't prosecute the individual and prove beyond reasonable doubt that they have committed a crime, at which point we can just confiscate the money. But we can, on the balance of probability, so a lower threshold, demonstrate that the money itself, not the individual, but the money is the proceeds of crime. So really important that we do that. That's what we are trying to do more with the paramilitary crime task force. UWOs are one tool for that, but actually what we've used much more is account freezing orders. So that UWO requires someone to give us information, and that can be useful. The account freezing order and then the account forfeiture order actually freezes that money and then allows us to seize it. So what I don't actually have is the figures for the number of AFOs that we have used in Northern Ireland, which would properly answer your question. But to properly answer your question, it needs to look at the range of powers we use rather than just UWOs. And then the final point, there is also, and always is, a lot of challenge around the use of these powers. So you may or may not be aware, but the use of a UWO in Northern Ireland is in before the Northern Ireland courts at the moment. And that's over a year after the UWO was first issued. And we still haven't got the information back because the people we put it on always challenge back. And we see that across a range of our activity. And that, I think, is part of, it's a relatively new power. As it beds down, there are always lots of legal challenges. Every avenue is tested. And once that process has been through, and we'll see what the judge concludes on this particular case, but I'm hopeful and confident, then we'll be able to do more of it. But what will matter is, I think, not just the use of UWOs, but the use of our civil recovery powers in the round.
I suppose for me, if the judge doesn't conclude the right decision, then you need to change its title, because it seems fairly basic. It's unexplained wealth. That's unexplained wealth. And I think the powers should be easier for you to use as opposed to more difficult to use. Because, I mean, there's no defence for someone who doesn't have a job, but has a nice car, has all the jewellery, has the big fancy house with all the big gardens, and there's no explanation. So the unexplained wealth would surely tick that box. And until that's defined properly and used properly, then I don't think we're going to see any success, certainly according to statistics you've just used.
Okay.
And I'll just add to that, sorry, that is for us, it is also for HMRC as well, because if it's unexplained wealth, they won't be paying tax, and they have got really strong powers to investigate and seize. So we work with them as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Colleagues, thank you for your questions. Chief Constable, Director General, thank you very much to you and your teams for taking questions and their ongoing work of force on behalf of the community. Thanks also to all of us joining in the room and online. That concludes today's session. The next meeting will be Thursday, the 6th of July. Thank you very much.